It's been a hot minute since I posted my first video, but I've been quite busy behind the scenes getting things up and running with my website. Now that's up and running, we're going to put that to one side and hopefully just get on with making some art for a little while. Now, one of the things you will find on the website is a portfolio of my work, and a lot of that is paintings of animals. As I mentioned in the last video, I absolutely adore painting animals, and it was one of the things I spent a lot of time doing and practicing during the pandemic. That has kind of naturally evolved into me opening my books to take on commissions for pet portraits. I'm super excited about this, and the really wonderful thing is, even though my company has only been officially in existence since the 14th of December 2022, I've already had a flurry of orders where people have asked me to paint their cats and dogs for them as gifts to give for Christmas. I've even been lucky enough that I've had 4 or 5 commissions overnight since last night, when a friend shared my page with her local community on Facebook. But enough of the sales pitch for now. What I wanted to talk about was how you yourself could have a go at painting your own pet portrait. And I'm going to start by talking you through the process of painting this little guy who is called Sammy. This was actually a commission from my parents to give to their friends as a surprise gift. They're absolutely besotted with Sammy, who unfortunately is actually quite ill at the moment. He's a fairly old pup. He's 15 or 16 years old and sadly has throat cancer. It's not anything that will be curable, but he's doing reasonably well on some high dose steroids. He's able to eat and is not in pain or any distress, so they're just taking it day by day. Sammy is gorgeous inside and out, and when my dad found this photograph on his phone of him, I just knew that it was the perfect one to capture his character with in watercolour. The very light sketch that you can see there was done with a water-soluble graphite pencil by the brand Viarco, or Artgraph, a Portuguese company who do some really fantastic water-soluble graphite products. And I literally just mapped out where the most important features of Sammy's face were to begin with, and then the outline of his head, his body, his legs and his tail, just so that I knew where he was sitting on the page. There's no detail at this point whatsoever. I really didn't want that. This is a loose, expressive piece, and it's not meant to be photorealism. Hopefully it just captures his character rather than every single last piece of fur on his body. The thing that I love about water-soluble graphite is how it melts into the painting and it almost becomes invisible, and certainly when you're painting with dark colours or greys like I am for this little black and white dog, it doesn't become overly noticeable in the finished piece. I'm painting on a piece of 100% cotton rag watercolour paper, and I'm using my absolute favourite brushes for painting animals with, and these are the silver black velvet brushes. Now, I've had these for a lot of years and before I went vegan even, so I'm afraid they are a blend of synthetic fibres and squirrel hair, so if they ever do become too damaged to use, I won't be replacing them like for like. But I have to say, the softness and that lovely floppy nature of the brush, with the ability to carry lots and lots of water and pigment, make them fantastic for these expressive paintings. Once I've got enough pencil lines down to know where I'm placing Sammy on the page, it's time to start painting, and I'm using a beautiful watercolour by Schminker called Tundra Violet. It's one of their super granulating range, which is widely documented here on YouTube. It has this bluish and reddish undertone to it, and it granulates absolutely beautifully. You can dilute it down to the palest of greys, and you can get it dark enough that it's near black. Well, it's more of a charcoal in its most saturated mass tone. It layers up beautifully, and you can build up the depth of pigment really well with subsequent layers, and especially when you're using a cotton rag paper like this, you're able to push and pull the pigment around without fear of the paper pilling, and that's when you get little bobbles of paper when the surface starts to dissolve as you put more and more water and pigment down. My first strokes are usually made with a very light wash indeed, where it's more water than pigment if anything, and I'd like to try and start at the darkest values and work my way towards the more lighter values areas of the painting. My aim here isn't to replicate every single piece of fur that Sammy has, as I said before, and it's more to just get a sense of his playfulness, his character, his cute fluffiness. So my strokes are quite loose, not very controlled. I flick the brush here and there and stroke away and gradually suggest the layers of fur on his ears and around his nose, etc. And I find that the result is so much better when you approach it with the idea that you're going to give a suggestion of fur rather than trying to paint individual hairs, because it never comes off as well as you might want it to, or certainly not in my hands anyway. Although that Tundra Violet is the predominant paint that I'm using for this painting, I did need to get a little bit more depth for his collar, for example. So, shock horror, I'm breaking one of the fundamental rules of pure watercolour technique, and that is to use a black watercolour paint. This one, however, is made by a little company called Greenleaf Blueberry, and it is really, really beautiful. The black is really rich and it granulates just enough that it gives life to the painting without actually dulling down any of the tones. And when you're using it selectively, like to just darken up the darkest areas around his eyes and the blackness of his leather collar, then you're not losing out, you're not killing all that beautiful separation of pigment from the Tundra Violet. Now at this point in the painting, I've got quite a lot of pigment down on Sammy's head, and it's been perhaps 10 or 15 minutes since I started putting the paint down, so things are starting to dry a little bit. I'm now able to go back in and layer up over those initial very watery grey layers and build in the tone. In watercolour, you'll find that some particular paints will have a big drying shift, and what that means is when the paint is wet and just freshly applied to the page, it'll look a lot darker, and then as it dries it becomes very much lighter. Well, luckily the Tundra Violet and the black paint that I'm using here don't do an awful lot of that. They also don't take that long to dry on this lovely absorbent cotton rag paper, so you're able to go back in and start layering up more tones. And here you can see I've started to introduce this soft brown colour, and this is another favourite of mine, one that I reach for in almost every painting I do, called Go Fight by Daniel Smith. This is a lovely transparent colour, and it just gives a little bit of warmth to some areas where, for instance, his chin is a little bit browny grey and he's a little bit muddy around the tips of his paws. So I've added a little bit of pigment here just to give some depth to his body in those areas. At this point in the painting process, I felt that I had enough detail down on his face that I could start to move into the other areas of his body to focus more on bringing life to the painting rather than realism. So I noticed in the reference photograph that the white fur on his left shoulder actually had a warm blue tone to it. So I've added a light wash of some Verdita blue mixed with a little bit of that grey still left on my brush. And on the right side of his body, he's actually sitting on a patch of fairly dark grass in the photograph. And there was a bit of a bluey green, a cooler tone showing through the white fur in this area. So I've gone in with another favourite, a phthalo turquoise, again by Daniel Smith. As clearly he is a little black and white dog and doesn't actually have any turquoise or blue in his fur, you don't want these colours to be very powerful, and they are fairly pigmented, and in the Verdita's case it is a little on the opaque side if you put lots of pigment down. So I try to put a suggestion of the colour where it needs to go, and then use mostly water on my brush to blend and to smooth it away so there's no harsh edges, and you're just getting a nice glaze of colour in certain areas rather than a stripe of turquoise where a stripe of turquoise clearly doesn't belong. When I'm painting animal portraits, I try to keep all of the detail in and around the face, and in particular around the eyes, so that's something that I'll come back to later. And when it comes to the body, I want to get the pose right so that you're suggesting his playful nature and getting a sense of his character, but I don't want you to be drawn in and stare at the fur on his chest or the tufts on his tail too much. Yes, I want them to be there and I want them to be recognisable as those body parts, but these strokes are much looser. There's a lot more water on my brush and I'm trying to blend things out a lot more, so as you move away from the centre of his face, things get gradually softer as the brush strokes get more and more gestural and suggestive. You don't want to be putting too many detailed strokes in there because we want the attention to be on that cute little adorable face and not so much on his paws or back legs. Now we've worked our way out from his face, down his body to his paws and his tail, and we're starting to consider what is going to be around Sammy. And whilst I'm not going to reach for the green paint to pop the grass in the background that he's sat on in his photograph, I am going to start making sure that my strokes are flicking out from his body, and in particular on his tail where his fur is at its longest, so that you're getting some of that medium tone grey, sort of carving out the fluffiness of his tail against the grass. That's going to make more sense when you see the green paint going down later on in the painting. But for now we're still focused on his body. As he's more white than black on his lower limbs and tail, I'm using that mid-tone grey to suggest the shadows and the darkest areas of his fur, and to also give some separation from him in the background. But once the green paint goes down, you can use that to delineate the lightest areas of his fur around the tips of his tail, for example, and around his paws, where you can flick the green paint in towards him with your brush strokes so that you're getting a bit more definition of his long shaggy fur. To make sure that the painting stays nice and in soft focus, here I'm brushing just plain water, no pigment whatsoever, on a clean brush all the way around Sammy's body. Now around his paws and tail I'm going really quite close and even blurring out the edges and softening up any of those grey areas where things are looking a little bit too crisp. But when it comes to his head and around the ears, I've tried to make sure I'm staying just a little bit away, maybe a millimetre away from that pigment, so that we don't get any bleeding. And also it helps to backlight because you get a little bit of a white halo around the grey fur that casts the impression of some sunlight coming in from behind Sammy, as well as from where the majority of it is coming, and that is from the front right hand side of the image. The thing that perhaps brings me the most joy from painting watercolour portraits of animals is how the very nature of the medium is quite loose. And yes, you could get your pens, your fine liners, some permanent ink in a fountain pen and crisping up the edges and giving outlines and what have you. But for me, I really love how a splash of colour here, a splodge there, a splatter there is so much more evocative and can give more to character than being absolutely slavish and replicating exactly what you see in front of you, whether that's drawing from real life or from a photograph. Photorealist artists are hugely skilled and very patient as far as I'm concerned, in their slavish replicating precisely what they see in front of them. But for me, watercolour's nature is that it's a little bit unpredictable. You don't know absolutely with certainty what is going to happen when you put brush to page, but that only helps give a looseness and a life that you just can't get when you're being really, really precise and getting out your fine liners and drawing every last blade of grass or every last hair. If anything, adding in that detail in the background would just make it far too busy and take attention away from those gorgeous eyes, and we don't want that at all. So I'm coming to the very end of the painting here. I'm using a stiffer synthetic brush by Silver Brush again, but a different fibre, just to add a little bit more pigment around his eyes. And at this point I've been painting for approximately 30 minutes. I'm soon going to step away and leave the painting to dry overnight before coming back in and glazing over some lovely warm brown tones over his eyes, just to give that fullness to them and the gloss that you can see in the photograph. The eyes are my most favourite part of any animal portrait because they just give so much emotion to the piece, and I really love to glaze a colour over them, if a colour belongs there of course. And in Sammy's photograph there was a hint of a warm brown, like a transparent red oxide or a burnt umber, which I added to the painting the following day when it was absolutely bone dry, so not to disturb those darkest areas of tundra violet beneath. I hope that this was helpful to give you a little insight into my process and how I go about creating these animal portraits. Do let me know if a more detailed step-by-step walkthrough of the process would be more helpful, or reach out if you'd like to commission me to paint your favourite animal for you. Until next time, keep painting, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next video.